Marketplace is supported by Progressive Insurance. Customers can simplify their insurance needs and protect what's important by bundling home and auto. Learn more about bundling at progressive.com.
What do you suppose is the macroeconomic word of the day, huh? One guess. That's all you get. From American Public Media, this is Marketplace.
Marketplace is supported by Commvault. Businesses can recover data as well as cloud applications and platforms after a cyber attack in just minutes with Commvault, so they can become a continuous business. And by Amazon Business, dedicated to helping businesses save time on office tasks and empower leaders with business buying solutions that support teams to focus on growing the business. Learn about smart business buying at amazonbusiness.com.
In Los Angeles, I'm Kai Risdall. It is Wednesday today. This one is the 26th of March. Good as always to have you along, everybody. True story. When I woke up this morning, I said to myself I was going to try to get through the show today without saying the word tariffs. I know, but a guy can dream, right? And in any case, the President of the United States had other plans. Word from the White House today, more tariffs coming, automobile imports this time. Details, as they always seem to be, vague and variable. Import taxes are, as you know, the president's most favored economic tool, in part because he claims they're going to help shrink the trade deficit and get Americans to buy more American stuff instead of foreign stuff. Which, A, that's kind of not how that all works, and B, allow me to introduce you here to the law of unintended consequences. Marketplace's Sabri Ben-Achour gets us going.
There was the Simpsons episode where Homer traveled back in time to the age of the dinosaurs.
As long as I stand perfectly still and don't touch anything, I won't destroy the future.
He obviously touches something, kills a bug, and messes up the future, which he finds out when he gets back.
Don't you remember, Dad? Flanders is the unquestioned lord and master of the world.
Economics is sometimes a little bit like that. You mess with one thing and something else gets messed up. Take the trade deficit. The U.S. imports more than it exports. Mary Lovely is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is a marketplace underwriter.
Okay, so the trade deficit reflects the difference between U.S. income and U.S. consumption.
More money going out of the house than coming in. We're all just shooting dollars out the door to Temu every day. Now, if that was all that was going on decade after decade, we would have no money and the world would have just dollars piling up worth nothing. That is not happening because those dollars that we send out into the world, they do not stay there. They come back.
They're used to buy American assets.
Matt Slaughter is dean of Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business.
U.S. stocks, they're usually purchasing maybe U.S. corporate debt. They're definitely purchasing U.S. Treasury securities.
Now, let's imagine that the trade deficit were magically smaller. We're sending fewer dollars out the door. So fewer dollars are coming back in the door as investments. Fewer loans to business. Fewer loans to the government.
If foreigners are buying fewer American assets, either the federal government has to borrow less or the private sector.
Robert Lawrence is professor of international trade and investment at Harvard. A world with a smaller trade deficit is a world where this country is borrowing less because there's fewer dollars coming in, because there's fewer dollars going out. There's just one problem. The government does not look like it is about to borrow less. Mary Lovely again.
You know, all forecasts are they're going to increase the federal budget deficit.
So if the government isn't borrowing less and the trade deficit's supposed to go down, that means someone else is going to have to borrow less. And that would be the rest of the economy. You know what could make the economy borrow and buy a lot less? A recession. In New York, I'm Sabri Ben-Achour for Marketplace.
On Wall Street today, tariffs, even the whisper of them, a hint, the merest mention was enough to send traders scurrying. We will have the details when we do the numbers. We're going to get, come Friday next, the employment situation summary for March. We're going to put it, I'd imagine, right up at the top of the show, and you're going to hear me say something like, the unemployment rate last month was whatever it was, which is fine as far as it goes. But the thing is, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually publishes 6 unemployment rates in total, each of which measures a different bit of what economists call labor underutilization, basically workers not working. And those rates right now range from 1.5%, 1.5%, up to 8%. Marketplace's Mitchell Hartman has the rest of that story.
Aurora Asbill is 25 from Dayton, Ohio. Theater is her passion and profession.
I build costumes.
She moved to New York City 2 years ago with a theater tech degree and eventually landed a job in a shop making costumes for movies and Broadway shows.
While I had like a 9-to-5, if Broadway is not doing any cast changes, nothing's opening, hours get cut, I would walk in the morning. My boss would be like, sorry, girl, like, we don't have any work for you. Like, you can go home. Maybe I'll see you in 2 weeks.
When this happened, she'd try to find short-term freelance gigs to tide her over.
You can't really fall back on, oh, well, I'll just file for unemployment. You're constantly looking for work.
She had a job, though she sometimes didn't get any hours or a paycheck. She did temp jobs, but it didn't pay the bills, and she was aggressively looking for a new job. So would Asbill be counted in the monthly jobs report as unemployed? Underemployed? It's actually not an easy answer. Victoria Gregory is a labor economist at the St. Louis Fed. She says each of the unemployment rates the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes, labeled U1 through U6, tries to get at a different slice of people who tell the survey takers they want to work but aren't working, or aren't working as much as they want to.
Going from narrowest to broadest, U1 is just capturing the long-term unemployed for 15 weeks or longer, which is a lot longer than the typical unemployment spell.
She says that matters because the longer folks are unemployed, the less likely they'll get another job soon. Next.
U2, this starts to add in job losers because of a layoff or a firing or their temporary job ending.
And that might be the unemployment category Aurora Asbill would fall under, a temporary layoff. Or perhaps the next one, U3, when she gave up on the first job and started looking for a new one.
U3 is the official rate, the simplest notion of unemployment. It just captures people who want a job and have actively been searching for one within the last 4 weeks.
And that official rate has its virtues, says Harvard economist Lawrence Katz.
We've been collecting it the same way for like 80 years. It's comparable over time. It's comparable internationally.
But, he says,
it's not everybody facing distress in the labor market.
This has been a long-standing criticism, that the official rate is an undercount.
It doesn't count you if you're so discouraged, you're not doing something active to find work. If you work 10 hours a week, but that's not enough to support yourself and you really want to work full time.
In recent decades, BLS has added more measures of unemployment. The broadest, U6, includes discouraged workers, the marginally attached who want work but haven't looked recently, and involuntary part-time workers, also called the underemployed. Rebecca Dixon at the National Employment Law Project follows the U6 closely.
7.5% in January, bumped up to 8% in February. Seeing that increase is an example of the labor market slowing down.
I'm always much more concerned with the U6.
Tulane economist Gary Hoover.
What's happening with marginalized workers on the periphery of the economy, those will be the ones most quickly dismissed.
They're the workers with the least education and experience, more likely to be women and minorities, last hired and first fired in a downturn. Hoover calls it
the canary in the coal mine, a harbinger of things to come, and it'll probably show up later on in the U3.
These unemployment rates edging up recently suggests that the economy is starting to perform less well, especially for the least advantaged workers. And given rampant economic uncertainty and rising hesitancy by businesses to hire, it could be a sign of worse times to come. I'm Mitchell Hartman for Marketplace.
Universities are among the highest profile targets of the spending cuts being engineered by Elon Musk and his operatives. And the temptation here is to say, come on, universities have plenty of money, especially the ones with 9-figure or more endowments. Well, maybe not. Elizabeth Popp Berman is a professor of organizational studies at the University of Michigan, also the author of a post entitled, "No, University Endowments Can't Replace Federal Science Funding." Professor Berman, welcome to the program. Good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess we start at the very beginning here, which is endowments, what are they? Because contrary to popular opinion, they are not just a giant pool of money.
Right. The first thing to know about endowments is that they are actually tens of thousands of little specific funds. So when a donor gives money to the university, they give it with some specific intent in mind. So maybe it's for a particular kind of cancer research, or maybe it is for a particular scholarship. And then the university agrees to hold that money and is allowed to spend the interest on it effectively on those specific things.
So $1 is not $1, right? They can't, sort of replace that with something else. They got to do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's oversimplifying a little, but that's what most of the endowment actually is.
Okay, so to the matter at hand, federal funding gets cut, as is happening now, and chances are it's going to happen more in the future. The point of this post is that university endowments cannot make up the difference, and the question then has to be why.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons, really. First, they're just not that large relative to the amount of money that the government contributes to universities. You know, most recently we've seen Columbia had $400 million immediately pulled from it, but the administration said they had $5 billion in contracts outstanding that could be pulled, right? So even though Columbia's got a $15 billion endowment, much of which it legally can't spend anyway, it can't cover something like that on more than a one-time basis.
The other thing you point out in this post is that, and I think you cite the University of Michigan, your university specifically, it's got like a $19-ish billion endowment, but it's tens of thousands of students with huge obligations, and so on a per-student basis, you can't get there from here.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing, too, is that it's easy to forget just how large these institutions actually are. So the University of Michigan has an annual budget of something around $14 billion. So again, if you sort of translate this into the kinds of terms of kind of a ordinary family, right? If you make $100,000 and you have about that much in savings, it's not like you can really just retire on that and support yourself.
We've all heard of, and I actually have friends who in academia who pointed out that PhD enrollments are being put on hold, if not completely rolled back. What are you seeing in Ann Arbor? And the point to make here clearly is that you don't speak for the university, but what's your experience?
Sure. I mean, I think what you see right now is that research programs are being cut. Lines of work that I think most people in the public would be generally very supportive of. We have a huge medical center that does tons of cancer research, for example. Those programs are just kind of grinding to a halt. And so the university is doing a lot to try to backstop that in the short run. But right now they've said they're going to be able to backstop about maybe 6 months to kind of give people some time to transition, but there's no long-term solution to federal funds going away.
With the acknowledgement here that you are an academician and not a tax policy specialist, there is on the table, certainly in Washington, Vice President Vance has said he wants to tax university endowments at something like 35%, and they are now, if not tax-free, then much lower levels of taxation. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated because I do think that it's a problem for the sector that there's so much inequality between very wealthy institutions with large endowments and the majority, a large majority of colleges and universities that have almost no endowment to speak of. So I might support an endowment tax that was going to help fund underfunded parts of higher education. But I think right now what we're looking at really is a potential endowment tax that is essentially going to fund tax cuts for the well-off.
You mentioned inequality there. It should be pointed out that there are like 20 institutions of higher learning in this country with $20+ billion endowments, and they get all the attention. But most schools have way less, if any, right? And I guess the point is these endowments do contribute to inequality.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to remember is that, when we read the news, we're really reading about the same handful of 5 or 10 or 20 institutions that do have these large endowments, but most colleges are not in this position. You know, your regular regional university down the street that enrolls a lot of students in your community does not have an endowment that's contributing in any significant way to its bottom line. And rising endowments have kind of contributed to that inequality, but, you know, as part of a larger story.
All right, so look, here comes the put up or shut up question. If federal funding is really going away, which certainly seems to be the case, and endowments can't make up the difference, as you lay out in this post, now what do we do?
I mean, I think if federal funds truly go away, universities will still exist, but they will just be smaller. They will not be globally competitive. And a lot of really important work that has been getting done will no longer happen.
Elizabeth Pop Berman is a professor of organizational studies at the University of Michigan. Professor, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up.
People aren't buying the drinks and they're not buying the extra appetizer. They're not buying that bowl of soup.
You know, a side order a day could keep the restaurant closures away. First, though, let's do the numbers. Dow Industrial's down 132 points today, about 0.3%, landed at 42,454, did the blue chips. The Nasdaq down 372 points, 2%, 17,899. The S&P 500 gave back 64 points, 1.1%, 57 and 12. GameStop jumped more than 11% today after its board said it would use some of its corporate cash to invest in Bitcoin. The video game seller also announced plans to close what it described as a significant number of its stores this year. Other meme stocks, you say? Sure. Crypto miner AGM Holdings jumped 12.1% today. Private jet charter firm Jet AI gave back 2.8%. Bonds down. Yield on the 10-year T-note rose 4.35%. You're listening to Marketplace.
Marketplace is supported by Bitwarden Password Manager. Spring cleaning should also include digital security. Bitwarden is designed to help clean up weak passwords and offer access to all logins across all devices. Learn more at bitwarden.com. And by Cencora, bringing the companies and capabilities of AmerisourceBergen together under one new name. Cencora empowers healthcare partners with custom strategies to elevate patient care and accelerate positive outcomes at Cencora.com. And by Solidigm. Today's AI ambitions require a different approach to storage. Solidigm offers solid-state storage solutions optimized for AI with higher capacities, greater speed, and energy efficiency. StorageForAI.com.
WBEZ is supported by Amazon. WBEZ is supported by Lyric Opera of Chicago, presenting A Wondrous Sound, featuring the Lyric Opera of Chicago Chorus and Orchestra, with choral masterworks conducted by Enrique Mazzola, April 16th and 19th. LyricOpera.org.
Got a car you no longer need? Skip the hassle of selling. Donate it to WBEZ instead. It's easy, it's tax deductible, and it makes a real impact. Drive local news forward when you head over to WBEZ.org/cars.
Thanks for joining us tonight here at WBEZ. Here's a look at our forecast. Some clouds tonight with a chance of showers toward morning. Then Thursday, on and off showers, a high of 54, 74 on Friday. This is WBEZ.
You're listening to your public radio station. This is 91.5 FM, WBEZ, Chicago.
This is Marketplace. I'm Kai Risdall. Consumers in this economy just are not feeling so good right now. We talked about that yesterday. Mitchell did the story for us. Turns out small businesses are kind of down in the dumps too. The MetLife Chamber of Commerce Small Business Index slid nearly 7 points over the past quarter, wiping out its gains since Election Day. To be clear, small business owners do still think the economy's on pretty solid ground, but they're feeling, what's that word again? Oh yeah, uncertain. Here's Marketplace's Henry App.
It's been a quiet March for Rene Hidalgo, owner of Don Pepe Mexican restaurant in Houston, and he thinks that has a lot to do with the fact that he raised his prices this year because his costs keep going up.
Sometimes people comment, well, that's a little too much for a breakfast taco or breakfast plate, but I have no option. We have to pay for employees, all other bills, rent, electricity bill, and all that.
And rising food costs, especially eggs. Instead of raising prices, some business owners are just taking the hit. Janessa Perney owns Erskine's Grain and Garden, a farm supply store in Chester, Vermont. She recently ordered wood shavings for animal bedding from Canada, and her supplier crossed the border right before President Trump rescinded 25% tariffs.
I paid 20% extra. They swallowed 5% for me. So that kind of thing is really disconcerting. Thinking about those types of things are making it hard to plan cash flow.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey found a sharp uptick in business owners who feel concerned about their future revenue. Tom Sullivan is with the chamber.
We know that revenue, depending on how much of a chunk is taken out from inflation, is really what is going to result in growth, stability, or decline.
It'll determine, he says, whether businesses feel like they can hire more workers or make capital investments. But right now, what he's seeing
are small business owners hitting the pause button on growth plans for 2026 and beyond.
In Houston, Renee Hidalgo hopes business picks up in the next few months because right now he's at the front counter 7 days a week.
And I'm working here since opening in the morning till closing because I cannot afford to have another person, like a manager or something.
If business picked up, Hidalgo could hire someone to help out and take some time off. I'm Henry Epp for Marketplace.
Henry was just talking about business uncertainty. Believe me when I tell you, it's not just happening here. President Trump's trade and other policies are rattling the global economy too. And nowhere more than in China, where those trade frictions and their own consumer confidence issues are weighing on things. Consumer discretionary spending in particular, a category called food away from home, most specifically. Restaurant profits in Beijing last year, this is from municipal data, down more than 80%. The cause and effect connection here is that a lot of restaurants are closing, sometimes all of a sudden. Marketplace's Jennifer Pack has more now from Shanghai.
If you came to Shanghai late last year and asked where you could have a nice, not too expensive brunch with free-flowing alcohol, a popular choice would have been the Bowl and Claw.
Housed in a beautiful villa-style Lane house, 3 floors, so that's a lot of overhead.
Rachel Kwok writes a Shanghai-based food and drink blog called Nomfluence. She says the Bowl and Claw was part of a handful of restaurants and gyms owned by the Australian firm Camel Hospitality Group, which was established in 2010, when times were good.
They were printing money back in the day.
Like a lot of sectors in China. Fast forward to last November, when Camel Group sent a WeChat message to all its staff. One of them was graphics designer Joan Dai.
The document said that the company had dissolved and every employee's contract had been terminated. It said our salaries would be prioritized as soon as the company's bankruptcy liquidation was complete. Then the boss disappeared and he hasn't answered our calls since. He just ghosted us.
The number you have dialed is not in service.
I also tried, without luck, to reach former bosses at Camel Hospitality for comment. I did get one of the vendors it owes money to. Luckily, not a lot, says Maria, who supplies alcohol to restaurants. We're not using her full name because she worries about official retaliation for speaking about the economy in less than glowing terms.
I think it's extremely hard to get people to dine out right now.
She says that's because of China's real estate slump. People here invest most, if not all, of their savings in property, which used to be a safe bet until the market dropped.
So when real estate has started to sort of hit this brick wall, a lot of people have seen their main assets decrease quite a lot, and therefore they're tightening their purse strings.
Meantime, rents, labor costs, and social security taxes are all going up, says Bostonian Scott Manoy. He opened a popular restaurant chain in China called Element Fresh that serves sandwiches, salads, and smoothies. For a decade, all went well, but then
we started to see per restaurant profit level decline because simply
revenue would go up by 5%, costs would go up by 15-20% year on year.
Restaurateur Bryce Jenner once ran 7 sports bars and restaurants. Now just one is left, his Mexican food outlet Pistolera. He says the beginning of the end for his business came in 2018 when Chinese leader Xi Jinping got rid of the 2-term limit on the presidency, shaking consumer confidence.
The optimism went.
Then came the COVID lockdowns. Foreigners, key customers for Jenner and the Camel Group, left China. Jenner says he's friends with the Camel Group owners, and the last time they met was over a year ago to discuss what they should do in the downturn.
I'd said, hey, maybe we should fight this together. And they said, oh, yeah, I don't know. And we all sat there pretty sad.
In the end, Jenner sold off parts of his business, closed others. But even downsizing costs money. See, in China, companies legally need to pay severance to their workers. Again, Bostonian entrepreneur Scott Manoy.
And if we let everybody go that we should let go so that we can cut down on payroll, well, we'll be in the red immediately with the severance payment. So you kind of hang on 1 more month, 2 more months, 3 more months. Eventually you run out of cash. And that's what happened to us.
He quit the business 3 years before his Element Fresh chain officially closed in 2021. Today, some of the more established restaurants are still packed, says Bryce Jenner, though just one of his 7 restaurants and bars has survived.
But, people aren't buying the drinks and they're not buying the extra appetizer. They're not buying that bowl of soup. They're not buying the coffees.
Items that can increase the tab by 30-40%, he says. And until China's overall economy improves, restaurant profits will likely be very thin. In Shanghai, I'm Jennifer Pack for Marketplace.
Marketplace is supported by Lisa. Lisa believes that a better night's sleep should be available to everyone. Since 2015, Lisa has donated over 41,000 mattresses to shelters and those in need. Learn more at leesa.com. And by Pure Storage. In a world of fragmented systems, Pure Storage delivers a single, consistent, as-a-service platform for all data storage needs across on-premises, cloud, and hosted environments. More at purestorage.com.
This final note on the way out today, a couple of quick where things stand data points. Saw this first one in the Wall Street Journal, data from Cox Automotive, that car repossessions in 2024 were up 16% from a year earlier. That's the highest level they've hit since 2009 and the Great Recession. Also, and related, this one is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that almost 10 million people are past due on their student loans since the pandemic payment pause and an additional grace period ended last September. Our media production team includes Brian Allison, Jake Cherry, Justin Dueller, Drew Jostad, Gary O'Keefe, Charlton Thorpe, Juan Carlos Serrano, and Becca Weinman. Jeff Peters is the manager of media production, and I'm Kai Risdall. We will see you tomorrow, everybody. This is APM.
WBEZ is supported by the Other Art Fair, a 4-day fair at Artifact Events in Ravenswood, showcasing independent artists, thousands of artworks, and interactive experiences. March 27th through the 30th. Tickets at theotherartfair.com.
Probably the most important text in this entire series of texts comes from Pete Hegseth, who provides basically the attack sequence. And, it's detailed. It tells the exact time that attack will be launched. It tells the exact time the effects of the attack will be felt in Yemen.
I'm Rachel Abrams. That's Today on the Daily from the New York Times.
That's next, The Daily, here at 91.5 WBEZ Chicago. WBEZ is supported by Polymath University, a new kind of university in Chicago that empowers curious people to solve complex problems. More information about remote courses, including systems thinking, can be found at polymathu.org. Thanks for being here at 91.5 WBEZ.
If these guys go back to using Signal to discuss war planning, that's on them. That is what you would call reckless behavior. If they're going to not change certain procedures because they don't like the media or because they think that the Democrats are also bad, it just doesn't sound like a healthy country.
I'm Rachel Abrams. That's coming up on The Daily from the New York Times.
Live from NPR News in Culver City, California, I'm Dwayne Brown. The Supreme Court upheld a Biden-era federal regulation today that bans the so-called sale of ghost guns. The build-it-yourself untraceable gun kits are mainly bought online. The vote was 7-2, as NPR's Nina Totenberg reports.
Writing for the court majority, Justice Neil Gorsuch said that under the broad language of the 1968 Gun Control Act, the ATF was well within its statutory power when it enacted a new rule requiring those who make and sell unassembled gun kits to mark their products with serial numbers, keep records of their sales, and conduct background checks on buyers. The 2022 ATF action was spurred by an explosion of unmarked guns found at crime scenes across the country. Despite the court's decision upholding the regulation, President Trump could try to rescind it. Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
The Danish foreign minister is welcoming the cancellation of a planned visit by White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and the U.S. Energy Secretary to Greenland. As Terry Schultz reports, Vice President Vance will still be visiting, but with a pared-down agenda.
A press release from the Greenlandic government says previous plans for a U.S. delegation to visit various sites on the island have been canceled, and that Vice President Vance and his wife will go to the U.S. Patuxent Space Base on Friday. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen says it's, quote, very positive that the Americans have canceled their visit among Greenlandic society, referring to Second Lady Usha Vance's earlier intention to travel to historic sites and watch a dog sled race. Rasmussen told the Danish public broadcaster DR that now the Vances will, quote, only visit their own base, Patuxent, and we have nothing against that. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the uninvited visit unacceptable pressure amid President Trump's threats to forcibly annex Greenland.
This is NPR. The American Heart Association says many teens enter adulthood with risk factors for heart disease already in place and supports expanding insurance access. NPR's Maria Godoy reports.
By age 18, many young adults already have high blood pressure, obesity, high cholesterol, or type 2 diabetes, according to the American Heart Association. It says a growing number of younger adults are experiencing adverse cardiovascular events. One challenge is that as adolescents transition into young adulthood, they may stop going for regularly scheduled doctor's visits, such as vaccinations or sports checkups. In some states, without expanded Medicaid access, young adults can lose Medicaid coverage when they turn 19. In its statement, the American Heart Association says it's important to support policies that expand insurance access across the lifespan. It also calls for leveraging telehealth to increase healthcare use among young adults. Maria Godoy, NPR News.
Frito-Lay is recalling some Tostito chips in 13 states because they may contain milk that could cause allergic reactions. That recall includes 13-ounce bags of Tostitos Cantina traditional yellow corn chips. The company says people with allergies or severe sensitivity to milk could have an adverse reaction if they eat the chips. Frito-Lay says the affected bags were sold in southern and midwestern states. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include CFP, Certified Financial Planner Professionals, committed to acting in their clients' best interests. Learn more at letsmakeaplan.org. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
The Daily is supported by The Wall Street Journal, whose Take on the Week podcast breaks down the financial week ahead to help listeners navigate the markets. New episodes on Sundays.
For everything you need to know about the most important stories of the day, you're listening to The Daily from The New York Times, distributed by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that entertain and engage audiences everywhere.
From The New York Times, I'm Rachel Abrams. This is The Daily. It's being called a reckless and devastating breach of national security. Revelations that top Trump officials inadvertently shared secret U.S. military plans with a prominent journalist by mistakenly adding him to a group chat. Today, Atlantic Magazine editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg explains how he initially thought the messages were a scam, and now what he makes of the enormous fallout since going public. It's Wednesday, March 26th. So, Jeffrey, we have never met before, but yesterday I think I texted you, I emailed you, I called your publicist. I was desperate to get you on the show to talk about your story and the reaction to it.
Should have tried Signal.
That's right. So, as we're hinting at, you just wrote something that really everybody is talking about. So tell us, where does the story begin?
Well, the story begins in earnest about March 11th. I received a message request on Signal from someone identified as Michael Waltz. He's the National Security Advisor of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Signal, the secure messaging app.
Yeah, the commercial, non-government, end-to-end encrypted app that a lot of people in journalism and outside of journalism use because it's allegedly safer.
Right.
And I don't know Waltz. I've met him a couple of times, but it struck me as unusual because I have a somewhat contentious relationship with the Trump administration, or more to the point, with Trump. But I accepted the request, forgot about it. A couple of days later, I'm included in a group called the Houthi PC Small Group.
Can you translate that for us? What does Houthis PC Small Group mean to you in this moment?
Houthis are obviously the Iran-backed terrorist organization that runs part of Yemen and been obviously attacking shipping, attacking Israel for the last year and a half, becoming quite a menace to international shipping. PC stands for Principals Committee, meaning that small group of principals, cabinet members, people who run intelligence agencies.
And you are certainly, I think we need to point out, not a principal in this context.
No, I have never been to a principals meeting.
Right, just to be clear.
Yeah.
And who is in the group at this point?
J.D. Vance, Michael Waltz, and the Secretaries of State, Defense, Treasury, CIA Director, Director of National Intelligence, etc. People who are identified as such on my phone, but I'm an appropriately suspicious journalist, and obviously for reasons I can go into, I think this is a setup of some sort. I think this is a hoax, a deception, a non-state actor trying to entrap a journalist. I don't know what it is, but that on the face premise of this is ridiculous, so it had to be something other than what it was purporting to be.
And even though you think it's fake at this point, I'm sure you're still kind of curious. So what do they start discussing?
Well, there's this sort of elliptical promise of something happening over the next 72 hours. And the Michael Waltz user name asks these other principals to give their weekend POC, point of contact, in case there's a reason to have a further discussion. And most interesting in this moment to me is that the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, names a person and says this person is going to be representing the CIA in this discussion. Now, what I learn over time is that the person he names is an active CIA officer whose name has never been discussed in public. I thought, well, like, this is really weird. What is happening here? But that's the initial foray. And then the next day, there's a really interesting substantive policy debate about whether the U.S. should ramp up its military activities against the Houthis in Yemen. And J.D. Vance starts the conversation out by saying he disagrees with the decision to attack Yemen, at least right now. And it's the European shipping that's in danger, not American shipping. And furthermore, the president doesn't really understand the consequences of doing this. And J.D. Vance is playing the role that we understand J.D. Vance to play, which is like kind of a soft isolationism. It's like, why are we fighting Yemen? What are we doing? And then the more kind of traditional, muscular, interventionist philosophy is represented by Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor, and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is, yes, we recognize that Europe is pathetic, and this is what Hegseth says about Europe, in all caps, by the way. They recognize this European dynamic, but they're more interested in just like, let's get this thing going against the Houthis.
So I want to check in with you here, because in this moment, do you still think that this is a hoax? Are you starting to sense that it could be real?
I am suspecting that it could be real because it's pretty accurate depiction of what these guys sound like.
Yeah.
But and let me put this in like, it can't be true.
Mm-hmm.
Like, come on. And also, it's weird that substantive government conversations will be taking place over Signal, because Signal is not, by the U.S. government standards, secure.
Mm-hmm.
In part because, obviously, it's technically open to anyone, including yours truly. And I know that previous administrations have used Signal. But my impression is, based on some reporting, my impression is that they use Signal to do things like setting up lunch appointments or, hey, I've just left Saudi Arabia, I'll call you from a skiff when I get to whatever.
And just to be clear, the skiff is a...
The skiff is a compartmentalized facility that is built to protect conversations electronically.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even take your phone or your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. These are very, very, very secure facilities, right? And the whole idea is to protect these conversations from foreign surveillance.
So what happens after this? How does this discussion progress from here?
Well, it progressed very quickly, so that on Saturday, the 15th, I am running some errands, and the Signal chat lights up. And probably the most important text in this entire series of texts comes from the account user Pete Hegseth, who provides what I would call basically the attack sequence, a summary of the war plan. And, it's detailed. It tells the exact time that attack will be launched. It tells the exact time the effects of the attack will be felt in Yemen. It talks about the weapons packages being used. It talks about some specific targets.
Like actual military planning that is a settled business and about to happen.
A forthcoming attack on Yemen. I'm also sitting there in my car. It's 11:44 a.m. Eastern time. I get this text. The text promises that the effects of the first wave of attacks will be felt in Yemen at 1:45 p.m. Eastern time. So it's 2 hours, right? And I'm thinking to myself, well, I guess in 2 hours, I'm going to find out if this is a real chain or not, right? Definitively. So, I basically just kind of sit there, and at 1:55 or so, I go into Twitter and I, put Yemen in the search bar. And then sure enough, there are bombs falling all over Yemen, just as the user identified as Pete Hegseth promised 2 hours earlier. So, I'm sitting in the car. I'm realizing that this is almost certainly a real Signal group and not some sort of deceptive disinformation campaign. And so then I had to begin to make a series of decisions, consulting with colleagues, that ultimately led me to remove myself from the Signal group later that day.
And can you tell us why you decided to leave the group chat?
I think people can make their own deductions here, but I can't get into, for various reasons, the conversations I subsequently had with colleagues and others about my decision-making. All I will say is that I remove myself from the group, understanding the consequences of that. And what I do is I decide, I have to write a story about the world's weirdest Signal group. On Monday, I texted and emailed the relevant people in the chat. I used the Signal contact. I sent long emails to a large number of players in this drama, asking various questions.
And what was the response?
Well, I got one official response back from the National Security Council, which, came pretty quickly, saying, apparently this is a real chain, and we're investigating why a journalist was inadvertently invited to the chain. But, I think they had to acknowledge it, and they did. Once they acknowledged that it's real, I published our first piece on the subject.
We'll be right back.
The Daily is supported by Condor Airlines, offering nonstop service to Frankfurt, Germany from 12 U.S. gateways, with connections in Frankfurt to many worldwide destinations. More information at condor.com. Condor welcomes you aboard.
And by Betterment, the automated investing app that does the work, allowing people to focus on what matters most. Learn more at betterment.com. Investing involves risk. Listeners of The Daily, get to the heart of the stories shaping the world. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/thedaily.
WBEZ is supported by Elmhurst University, presenting biographer Walter Isaacson, discussing timeless leadership on April 22nd. More at elmhurst.edu/cultural.
On the next Fresh Air, in a new book, Amanda Knox shares the difficulties she faced after being convicted and later acquitted of killing her roommate during a study abroad program in Italy. She'll talk about her journey to reclaim her identity from the notorious tabloid stories that defined her for years. Join us.
Tonight at 8 after The Daily on 91.5 WBEZ.
WBEZ is supported by Chicago Shakespeare, presenting Sunny Afternoon, based on the music of the Kinks, chronicling their rise to fame with hits like You Really Got Me, Lola, and more. Through April 27th, chicagoshakes.com.
I'm Jeremy Hobson. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says the U.S. is over-medicating children and adults with drugs for ADHD, depression, and obesity. So do you think America is over-medicated? That's next time on The Middle.
Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock on WBEZ. WBEZ is supported by Upright Interiors for Business, dedicated to creating customized corporate work environments. More on workplace designs and consultations at uprightinteriors.com.
Top Trump officials inadvertently shared secret U.S. military plans with a prominent journalist by mistakenly adding him to a group chat. Atlantic Magazine editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg explains how he initially thought the messages were a scam, and now what he makes of the enormous fallout since going public.
Jeffrey, this is such a breach of security protocols. Can you explain the hazards of this from a security point of view?
Yeah, put aside the weirdness of inviting a journalist by mistake. I mean, okay, it's hard to put aside, obviously, given what's happened, but one of the things that people don't understand is that Signal might be end-to-end encrypted and it might be very hard to hack, but foreign intelligence services spend a lot of time trying to target the actual devices that belong to government officials, right? Like, in other words, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is walking around with a cell phone in his pocket. It should not surprise anyone to know that the Chinese government is very interested in knowing what's going on inside that phone, and it uses all kinds of methods where, in a remote way, you can target that phone.
And in this particular scenario, this particular attack on the Houthis, if a foreign adversary had gotten this information that you saw, what is the worst case scenario? Like, can you just play out the possibilities a little bit?
You're the National Security Advisor of the United States. You're the CIA director. You don't want your target in Yemen to know that in an hour or so, he's going to get blown up. So, yes, like if you put this stuff out in the wild and in Signal and you're not talking about this in a secure way, face to face, theoretically, the danger level goes up.
Right.
I mean, this is so this is so obvious to me. Like, logic dictates this.
Yeah, I just don't want to breeze over it. I want to make it really clear for people that the reason that it is important for the government to take all of these precautions and conceal these types of plans is that this information getting out there could compromise a military mission. It could put military service members at risk. Those are the
greater
stakes
risk,
here. Yes.
Right? Greater
risk. Those are the stakes here.
And also the success and failure of your mission, right?
Right, of course. And because these are the stakes, did the existence of this group chat adding you, was any of this illegal?
I can't answer that question. I'm not a national security lawyer. We've interviewed national security lawyers who say that, there are various risks associated with doing this the way they did it. That will be discovered in the fullness of time. But there are people who get kicked out of the military. There are people who go to prison for compromising security at a much lower level than we're about to attack Yemen. Here's how the attack is going to go.
Right. Is there any chance that anybody on this group chat could believably say that they didn't know that they were supposed to take different kinds of precautions?
I mean, I guess you could say that, but is ignorance of the law, does that absolve you of following the rules? Although some of them have obviously served. Marco Rubio was on the Intelligence Committee. John Ratcliffe was the former DNI. Pete Hegseth served in the Army, and so on.
It really makes you wonder what else is being communicated this way.
How many other small groups are there?
And also, why would these folks be communicating this way? I mean,
know why?
Why?
You know why?
Tell me.
Because going into a skiff is a pain in the neck.
Even if it's in your basement?
I mean, you got to go to the supermarket. You got to go take your kid to Little League. I mean, all these people do have security details. Mind you, they're driven in armored Suburbans, and they have very extensive communications devices associated with those vehicles. I mean, the idea is to make it maximally convenient. And by the way, this is...
So that's it. It's convenience.
I don't know. Or if you talk about it on Signal, you're obligated to make a copy of that discussion and send it to an official government account so that it can be archived by the National Archives. But Signal is a disappearing app. Obviously, the messages disappear.
Well, they can. You can set it to disappear. Is that what happened here?
Yeah, and these were set to disappear.
I see.
And so there is the plausible explanation that they're like, we just want to have real talk, and we don't want this to be archived forever in the National Archives.
I think the natural question is to say, under normal circumstances, there would probably be an investigation led by Congress. Democrats are obviously calling for that, but it just feels like there must be so little interest in an investigation from anybody with the power to do it. And I just want to give you some examples of the reaction to your story that make me say that. Because over the past 24 hours, the Republicans have really played this down. And I just want to quote from Pete Hegseth here, because immediately after your story came out, he denied that he had shared war plans. He said that you yourself were a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said, this is not our issue. Senator John Kennedy said a mistake was made. It happens. Trump himself said, Mike Waltz is a good man. He's learned a lesson. Do you think there will be any consequences for the people who initiated or participated in this breach of national security?
Nothing that's been said by the administration so far suggests to me that they're treating this seriously or treating it the way they would treat it if this were Democrats who had done this. I mean, this is this kind of arid, dispiriting Washington game where when you commit a crime, it's the worst thing that ever happened on the planet. And when I do it, it's perfectly acceptable and understandable. Here's the thing, and this is sort of what I would love to say to Pete Hegseth. 6 months ago, if Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Defense in the Joe Biden administration were communicating with Kamala Harris over Signal about an imminent military attack and describing to Kamala Harris which weapons are going to be used in the attack. And they mistakenly included a journalist in that conversation. Do you really think Pete Hegseth would say it's not a big deal?
Do you think that they think that the mistake here is being accidentally included and this getting out, or having used Signal in the first place?
What I understand from inside the White House, I've talked to a couple of people and obviously read some of the reporting in the last period of time. They think that Mike Waltz is a dope for including me in the chat, and they're really focused on that. I mean, there's not a fantastic record of Democrats being completely assiduous about the storage and safekeeping of classified information. I mean, nobody's perfect here, but we're coming out of a situation where the current president was actually indicted for hiding classified information in a bathroom. This is the president, of course, who is known to have discussed classified operations on the veranda of Mar-a-Lago. So, the tone is set from the top. I mean, there are people who take security very seriously, and there are people who don't take it very seriously. I don't think anybody would say that Donald Trump is one of those presidents who took it extremely seriously.
I just want to zoom out for a second because you have covered a lot of White Houses, and I assume that this is not the first time that you have had to weigh the public interest in publishing information that could be embarrassing against, national security risks. And clearly,
You decided that the story was worth publishing in the public interest to know how national security leaders are flouting security protocols. And I'm wondering, how are you thinking about this calculation? Do you think that we're safer now knowing what you reported?
First and foremost, what I discovered was what I consider to be a massive security breach, right? A breach you can drive a Mack truck through. The idea of reporting and the idea of having a free press and the idea of holding government officials accountable is that you make the world a better place by telling the citizens what's going on and what the government is doing. And so let's assume that this is a functional government and responds in ordinary ways to the discovery of flaws. With any luck, they'll tighten up their procedures and policies.
But if it does get brushed off, like, what does that say to you?
It says that we're in a dangerous place. Successful countries respond to observable reality by changing course to account for that reality. If these guys go back to using Signal to discuss war planning, that's on them. That is what you would call reckless behavior. If they're going to not change certain procedures because they don't like the media or because they think that the Democrats are also bad, it just doesn't sound like a healthy country. It doesn't sound like a healthy way to run a country.
Jeffrey, I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
On Wednesday morning, a day after senior administration officials insisted there was nothing classified in the Signal group chat, Jeffrey Goldberg released more of the messages containing details of strike plans. The texts, published in The Atlantic, show that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared the precise times that U.S. military jets would take off to strike Houthi targets, information that is typically highly classified.
The Daily is supported by the Financial Times, whose distinctive pink pages are dedicated to offering impartial coverage of America's economic agenda and key global business stories. There's more at FT.com. For everything you need to know about the most important stories of the day, you're listening to The Daily from the New York Times, distributed by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that entertain and engage audiences everywhere.
The Daily is powered by the journalism of the New York Times. It's distributed by APM, American Public Media. You can go deeper into the stories you hear on The Daily at nytimes.com/The Daily. That's it for The Daily. I'm Rachel Abrams. See you tomorrow.
There's a shortage of primary care doctors in the U.S., and wait times for appointments are long. In response, some doctors are converting their practices to a membership model. They charge membership fees to patients in exchange for reliable care.
But that means fewer people have access. So each time any physician makes that switch, it exacerbates the shortage.
That's tomorrow on Morning Edition from NPR News.
Listen for Morning Edition tomorrow, beginning at 5 a.m. here on 91.5 WBEZ.
WBEZ's PrisonCast brings you voices and stories from a world that's designed to be invisible, the Illinois prison system. Listen for our special PrisonCast show Sunday at 2 here on WBEZ Chicago.
WBEZ welcomes comedian Matteo Lane to the Athenaeum Center on April 9th. Lane shares recipes and stories from his debut cookbook, Your Pasta Sucks. Tickets at wbez.org/events.
When your organization or business partners with WBEZ as a corporate sponsor, listeners understand your commitment to the community. Corporate sponsorship of WBEZ can support your business while supporting regional reporting. Information at wbez.org/sponsor.
Thanks for joining us tonight here at WBEZ. Here's a look at our forecast. Some clouds tonight with a chance of showers toward morning. Then Thursday, on and off showers, a high of 54, 74 on Friday. This is WBEZ.
Broadcasting from Chicago's Navy Pier, this is WBEZ HD Chicago, 91.5 FM, WBEQ HD Morris, 90.7 FM, and WBEK Kankakee, 91.1 FM, Chicago's NPR news station.
From WHYY in Philadelphia, this is Fresh Air. I'm Tanya Mosley. Today, Amanda Knox. She was accused, convicted, and ultimately exonerated for the murder of her roommate, Meredith Kircher, while on a study abroad trip in Italy. Now in a new memoir, Knox opens up about many things she's never talked about before, including her efforts over the years to get the prosecutor in the case to see her as innocent, the narrative that she falsely accused another man of the murder, and why getting out of prison was not the end of her saga.
Yes, they had gotten Amanda out of prison, but they hadn't actually saved Amanda, because the girl who I was, that person died in Italy.
Amanda Knox's book is called Free, My Search for Meaning. And TV critic David Bianculli reviews the new Apple TV Plus series, The Studio. First News.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Speer. The Atlantic has now released the full text of a chat over an encrypted app involving senior Trump administration national security officials, which somehow included journalist Jeffrey Goldberg. NPR's Greg Myrie says it appears the chat was well underway even before military men and women were in the air.
2 hours before the operation began on March 15th, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth wrote, quote, "We are a go for mission launch." And then he kept providing updates saying F-18 warplanes and Reaper drones had taken off to carry out attacks. And keep in mind, the Houthis have shot down U.S. drones, so there are some real risks here. And Hegseth gave these real-time updates for several hours. He knew he was on Signal and not a secure government network, but he, of course, was unaware Goldberg had been inadvertently included in this group.
The attacks against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut, says the discussion of war plans should have been classified at the highest level. Vice President J.D. Vance is embarking on a trip to Greenland this week. He'll visit the only U.S. military base there. NPR's Joe Hernandez reports defense experts say it's critical to American national security.
Vidofik Space Base is a Space Force installation on the northwestern coast of Greenland. Its location between the northern U.S. and Russia is critical to the U.S. military, says Troy Bouffard, a professor of Arctic security at the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
The center sector there with that base is absolutely paramount.
The military conducts missile warning, missile defense, and space surveillance missions there. Construction on the base began in secret in 1951 in a joint effort between the U.S. and Denmark, which partially controls Greenland. Joe Hernandez, NPR News.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio is visiting Jamaica this week, talking about energy security, trade, and how to make U.S. aid more effective. He's defending the Trump administration's decision to dismantle the U.S. Agency for International Development. Here's NPR's Michelle Kellerman.
At the embassy in Jamaica, USAID employees are still on administrative leave as the Trump administration battles lawsuits back in Washington. But Secretary Rubio says the U.S. is not getting out of the aid business.
We are going to be providing foreign aid. The difference is we want to provide foreign aid in a way that is strategically aligned with our foreign policy priorities and the priorities of our host countries and our nation states that we're partners with.
But he's asking countries in this region not to accept doctors from Cuba, which he says are forced to labor. Jamaica's prime minister says Cuban doctors are incredibly helpful, and his country is careful not to exploit them. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, Jamaica.
On Wall Street, stocks lost ground today. The Dow dropped 132 points. The Nasdaq fell 372 points. You're listening to NPR. After hearing arguments this morning, it's looking like the Supreme Court may be inclined to preserve the roughly $8 billion the government spends annually to subsidize internet and phone services in schools, libraries, and rural areas. Justices heard nearly 3 hours of arguments as they reviewed a ruling that struck down as unconstitutional the Universal Service Fund. That tax has been tacked on to consumer phone bills for nearly 30 years. Both liberal and conservative justices expressed concerns about eliminating that funding. A Russian court has convicted 12 Ukrainians captured in the siege of the city of Mariupol on terrorism charges and sentenced them to lengthy prison terms. The trial was closely watched in both Russia and Ukraine. More from NPR's Charles Maines in Moscow.
Russian authorities say the Ukrainians were members of the Azov Brigade, a military unit captured following a weeks-long stand against Russian troops from inside a Mariupol steel mill in the spring of 2022. In Ukraine, the Azov fighters are lionized as heroes. In Russia, they're demonized as neo-fascists, and a reason the Kremlin launched its full-scale invasion. The verdict was issued in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, with the Ukrainians receiving between 13 and 23-year sentences. Several others were convicted in absentia, having been released in earlier prisoner swaps. Ukraine has compared the trial to a war crime, with several of the Ukrainians alleging torture by prison guards in their statements to the court. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
Crude oil futures prices moved higher today. That's amid new government data showing crude and fuel inventories fell last week. Oil up 65 cents a barrel to settle at $69.65 a barrel on the New York Mercantile Exchange. I'm Jack Spear, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Bank of America. From local shops to global enterprises, Bank of America is committed to helping businesses of all sizes make every move matter. Learn more at bankofamerica.com/banking for business.
I'm Deepa Fernandez. Thousands of Americans are victims of scams, some of which are highly sophisticated and personalized. How to recognize scams and avoid becoming a victim. Plus, the Alt Latino team joins us with the best songs of 2025 so far. That's next time, Here and Now.
That's Here and Now, tomorrow morning, beginning at 11 o'clock on WBEZ.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Tanya Mosley. And today my guest is Amanda Knox.
American Amanda Knox entered an Italian courtroom.
Convicted of a horrid crime in a foreign land.
Sentenced to 26 years for killing her roommate.
Her pleas for innocence seemed more cold and calculating than remorseful.
Amanda's MySpace nickname, Foxy Knoxy.
Dubbing her the angel face with the icy blue eyes.
Knox was catapulted into global infamy after being convicted and later acquitted for the 2007 murder of her British roommate, Meredith Kercher. She's become a symbol, though few still to this day can agree on what she represents. To some, she was an innocent woman unjustly imprisoned, a cautionary tale of a young student who became trapped by Italy's legal system. To others, she was a tabloid fascination, her every expression scrutinized and reinterpreted. In the years since her exoneration and return to the United States, Knox has worked to reclaim her narrative. In her first book, Waiting to be Heard, she focused on the details of her conviction. Her latest memoir, Free, My Search for Meaning, goes beyond the events of her trial and imprisonment and explores the realities of reintegrating into society and rebuilding a life. Wrongful convictions have become part of Knox's life's work. She sits on the board of directors of the Innocence Center, a nonprofit law firm dedicated to freeing innocent people from prison. Yet she grapples with a question that continually follows her. How dare she live when Meredith is dead? Amanda Knox, welcome to Fresh Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amanda, you wrote your first memoir, Waiting to be Heard. I think it was a year after you were released from prison. And you write that you thought it would be enough to set the record straight. Why hasn't it been enough?
I think because the record is so convoluted. I think that so many different stories arose around this case, and really a product was delivered by the prosecution and the media that resonated with people, even though it wasn't based on anything and it wasn't true. And that product really was this idea that women hate other women. It really came down to that, this idea that young women secretly hate each other and are constantly competing with each other, and in certain situations will sexually assault and murder each other. And it was a lie, and it's shocking to me that it wasn't seen for what it was at the time. But it was a story that resonated with people, and I think continues to resonate with people. And I think that in a big way, it wasn't even about Meredith anymore. I think a lot of people really didn't care very much about her or the person who committed the crime. They cared about this idea of a young woman hating another woman enough to sexually assault and murder them. That was titillating and fascinating to people, and that was ultimately the story that made the rounds of the world and resonated with so many people.
You and Meredith didn't know each other very well, did you? You all were brought together in Perugia through a study abroad program. What was your friendship like?
Oh, thank you for asking that. It's true that I didn't know Meredith very well. I had only known her for a few weeks. That said, when you study abroad, you get to know people really quickly because you're both of us were new arrivals to Perugia. We were both at the very same moment of our lives. I was 20, she was 21. She was studying journalism. I was studying languages. And we both happened to rent a room in this beautiful little house overlooking the countryside. And it was perfect. It was that beautiful time of your life when everything is possible and you have every reason to expect to have beautiful experiences. And, I feel so horrible about how she has been misrepresented in the media as well. Like the image of Meredith that was presented by the prosecution was of this like uptight, judgmental, English girl. And that was not at all who she was. She was, sure, she was a little bit more introverted than me, but she was very kind and very silly. And I remember thinking both that she was very sophisticated and elegant, and I think part of that was because she had a beautiful British accent, and I always was impressed by that. But other than that, like, she also kind of took care of me. Like, she was always asking me if I was getting home safe or who I was going out with and just checking in on me, and had this very big sisterly air. Like, one thing that haunts me to this day is we found this really cool little vintage shop, and she found this sparkly silver dress that she was very excited. She bought because she wanted to wear back home for New Year's Eve. And of course, she never got to wear that dress. And it just haunts me to this day. Like, I was right there with her. She was so excited. And I don't even know what happened to it. Like so much of our lives, like in a big way, two very young women went to Perugia, and one of them didn't get to go home, and one of them came home completely and utterly changed. And it's a grieving process for me, for both of us.
Yeah, I mean, there is that sentiment out there that because Meredith is the one who lost her life, maybe you don't have the right, at least publicly anyway, to mourn your own experience. And I was wondering, have you, or do you, or did you ever struggle with that feeling yourself?
I did, yeah. I think I've struggled both with survivor's guilt as well as with, someone just pointed this out to me, it's like survivor's guilt by proxy, where other people are sort of enforcing survivor's guilt onto me. And I understand where it's coming from, right? Like, so many people only know me in the context of her murder, and in particular through this very negative lens in the context of her murder. And so because they don't imagine me in the fullness of my human being, they sort of, anything that I do, whether purposefully publicly or not purposefully publicly, like when I got married, I did in no way intended that for that to be a public event. I went out of my way to make it very, very private and to be very, very secretive. And paparazzi showed up anyway. And then, of course, I get the messages from people saying, who will never get to get married? Meredith. And I just have that thrown in my face constantly, as if my life doesn't matter because she lost hers. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's because they're not capable of imagining me as a real human being.
To refresh people's memories, you were a 20-year-old college student studying abroad in Perugia, Italy, when you and your then-boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito, whom you'd known for a week before Meredith Kercher's murder, you both were accused and later tried and convicted, and both of you all spent 4 years in an Italian prison before being acquitted on appeal in 2011, and then 2 years later, both of you were retried and then definitively acquitted in 2015. And right now, you're still fighting a slander case, which we'll get to a little bit later. But you wanted to reach out to the prosecutor in this case. You all became pen pals, more or less, and ultimately met. This man was instrumental in spreading the false narrative about you and was ultimately instrumental in your conviction. How did it come to be, and why was it important for you to connect with him, to convince him of your innocence?
I guess for me, for a long time, he was the boogeyman, right? Like, he was the big scary man who was making decisions to ruin my life. And I was scared of him. I didn't understand him. I also was constantly asking myself, I think that the question that haunted me most, that I was attempting to discover the answer to, was why? Just simply why? Like, I've had, I don't know how many panic attacks because I was plagued by this not understanding why this thing had happened to me. And I knew that it wasn't an easy answer, right? Like, it wasn't just an evil man sitting in his prosecutor's office, you know, putting his fingers together like Mr. Burns and chuckling about how he was putting an innocent girl in prison. That was not what was happening. I knew that to be true. Or at least I assumed that to be true, because I tend to think that most people are not psychopaths, and I didn't think that he was a psychopath, and it didn't explain even why so many people believed him. And so there had to be something more to it. It had to be more complicated, but I couldn't figure it out. Like, I couldn't understand how this man looked at a 20-year-old girl with no history of violence, no history of criminality, no motive to commit this crime, and said, that's the person who's responsible for sexual assault and murder. Like, that woman is responsible for a man's crime. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I couldn't understand why this had happened to me. And so I spent years thinking about it and trying to understand it until I realized that I could just frickin' ask. I could just ask.
You wrote him.
I wrote him. And you know what? So many people advised me not to. Like,
including your family.
Including my family, including everyone in the innocence movement. They were all saying it's a waste of time. Prosecutors never apologize. They never realize that they were wrong. It's a waste of time. He's never going to admit fault. He's never going to... I think the thing that they were afraid of was that I was looking to this person for my well-being. I needed this person to be okay, and they didn't want me to need him to do
because
something
there was
to
a
be
big
okay.
chance that you wouldn't get it right.
Exactly. And so they were afraid that I was in some kind of Stockholm syndrome situation. And in a way, for a little bit there, I think I was. Like, I originally reached out to him thinking, I want to understand him. I want to know who this man is. I know he's not really a boogeyman. So who is this man? But also, if he could only see who I really am, maybe he would realize that he was wrong. And if he realizes that he's wrong, maybe he'll tell other people that he was wrong. And then my life will be much better. Like,
Amanda,
I did have
what kinds
that
of things did you write to him to try to show and prove your humanity?
The thing that I tried to do was imagine what Giuliano and I could agree on.
Because that's his name, by the way.
Yes, sorry. His name is Giuliano. Giuliano Mignini. But at the time, he was Dottor Mignini, Dr. Mignini. And I reached out to him, and I told him that I wanted to know him outside of this adversarial system where we were pitted against each other from the very beginning. And my step one was find common ground. What could he and I have in common? And at first, he was resistant. At first, he didn't know whether or not it was even legal for him to talk to me. Like, he's still a working prosecutor, has no idea. It's unprecedented for a defendant to reach out to a prosecutor. And it wasn't until I did a very public talk in Italy acknowledging that he was someone who had genuine, noble intentions in his prosecution of me, even if he was wrong, that he responded to me. And immediately, I think he was immediately just kind of shocked and impressed that I was willing to see him as a human being, which, I don't know, it just goes to show what kind of echo chamber that he was living in. Again, like, he's lived his entire life being fighting people and being in a very adversarial. And so someone approached him in this very non-adversarial way, someone like me who had every reason to hate him and to fear him. And he was moved by that and almost immediately moved. We ended up corresponding for 2 years about everything under the sun, the case, but also our lives.